Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of the Minority Report. I'm Chris Nunez, and today we have a special guest with us, Professor Steve Rosales of the History Department here at the University of Arkansas. Prof. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I would kind of like to just start with a little bit of your history, a little bit of your family history, kind of the story of, I know you are from California originally, personally.
Born and raised.
Just kind of the story of how you all came to California and eventually how you found yourself here in Arkansas.
The great-grandparents came during the Mexican Revolution. My grandmother was born 1918 in LA, Los Angeles, White Memorial Hospital, which is now in what is East LA, right? One of the more famous barrios in the US. So she was born there in 1918, and she was number 8 of 9. And so there was a younger, number 7 was born in LA as well, so I just don't know when. So the family must have arrived there 1914, 1915, somewhere in there, right? Probably as the fighting during the Mexican Revolution went north into the northern part. We're Norteños, we're from the northern part. My family tree is from northern Mexico, so from Chihuahua.
Okay. So,
which is right on the border with Texas, Arizona. So as the fighting went north, probably that was the push, around 1914, 1915. So through El Paso, right, which was the main entry point into the US for Mexicanos at the time. And then from there, at some point, they made their way to LA. During the 30s, right, there was what was called the repatriation drives, right, the Great Depression. Outsiders, the concern over outsiders was huge, even that much more. And so what began was a little known aspect to US history, right? These efforts to kick out Mexicanos, right, from all across the U.S., Southwest primarily, but also upper Midwest. But the usual consensus is about 500,000. And so my grandparents were forced to go. They never naturalized. My grandmother was born, right, 14th Amendment. She didn't have to go. She was U.S. born, but mom and dad are leaving. She was 15, 1933, so she was 15. So she had to go. So even though she was Mexican American, she had to go. So the family was kicked out in 33, and my grandmother came back in 46 through El Paso again, and they were in El Paso through the 50s, early 60s, where my mother was born in that time. She's one of 6. She's number 5. And then by the late 60s, they all migrated back to Los Angeles. And so I was born there in 1970. February 14th. So a border story, how about that?
Yep.
Right. If you go back far enough for Mexicanos, especially for northern Mexicans, you'll find a border story to some degree.
Tell me a little bit about the Hispanic and Latino culture in East LA that you grew up in.
It's Mexican American, right? Or a Chicano, just depends on what term you want to use. I mean, that's the term. It's increasingly falling out of vogue, but that's the term that I grew up with, and that's the term that I identified with, right? It was Mexican American. In the 80s, you start to have Central Americans, and there's tension there, and the tension's only grown since. Coming out here, a little bit different. Other parts of being up in Michigan, when I finished grad school, I was up at a university called Grand Valley State, where I was up there for 5 years, so a lot of Puerto Ricans up there, right? But just growing up in Southern California, in and around Southern California, and living in Southern California from LA through San Diego and all points in between, it was individuals of Mexican ancestry, right? Just depends on what political term they use to describe themselves. As Chicano, Mexican American, Mexicano, Chicano, American for some, right? For the more conservative inclined. And so other Latino groups not as present, other than perhaps maybe Central Americans. And so, yeah, it's certainly, it's different out here, but it's even changing out there, finally, certainly, to a smaller extent. There's other groups are beginning to arrive in larger numbers. And so not much of a mix, I guess. And what took me out of East LA in 1988 was I joined the Navy. And so I left for boot camp right after high school. I joined for 4 years. It was a culture shock, right? A lot of white folk, a lot of black folk, and Latinos that I met mostly were other Puerto Ricans. Right? And so it was a kind of an eye. All Latinos are not the same, and so I got to meet Tejanos, for example, right? Texans finally in the Navy, and it was an eye opener. It made me realize my Latino world was a little provincial, smaller, and so just joined the Navy. It was a shock, right? It was a cultural shock meeting other groups, but also meeting other Latinos from outside Southern California, like Tejanos, Puerto Ricans, and it made me understand that, yeah, all Latinos are not the same.
Can you expound on that a little bit? Because I think it's something that those who may be viewing or listening who are not Latino, it's very easy to group Latinos into one basket, so to speak. Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
That's a big one, sure. It's a biggie. I mean, any class on Latinos, or whenever I teach Latinos in a class, I usually start off with the two things, right? One, we tend to have a Mexican lens by which we view Latin America. They're all Mexican. No, right? No. There's Puerto Ricans, there's Central Americans, there's Cubans, each with their own trajectory coming here, right? Each with their own circumstances as to what brought them here to begin with, or continues to bring them here. And so you can't lump them all together. And we also tend to, number two, we also tend to have a very powerful presentist lens, what I call a very univision lens, right? And so like Tim Kaine in Phoenix, just within the last day or two, he's speaking, it's the consistency by which you have to sort of prove your chops to the Latino community by which you can speak Spanish. And I don't speak fluent Spanish, right? My mother insisted on English growing up. I'm pretty Americanized, actually.
Sure.
And a big part of that was actually the Navy. I'm still a reservist, 28 years this past June. I'm a lieutenant in the Naval Reserve. Mm-hmm. And so somebody arriving here in 1915 is probably thinking very, 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 very differently from somebody arriving here 2015. And so that point of arrival, right, when your generational process begins, it can produce a very, very different Latino. Right? And for the more recently arrived, sure, yes, probably Spanish is a big marker for them and that community that's arrived recently. Somebody who's been here 2, 3, 4 generations or more, you're probably not speaking Spanish. You're probably actually rather Americanized. I would hope that you have an understanding of what your heritage is, but in other words, another big divide within the Latino community is a generational one. When you got here, and I think the mainstream doesn't understand that.
Okay.
In California, yes, you have those folks. Yes, you have the recently arrived, but you have a layered community. The recently arrived, some who've been here maybe a little while, and some who've been here for a long while, right? And so you have much more of a mix. And so you have English and Spanish dominant out in California, right? It's 40 out of the 2010 census, 44% of the California's population is Latino. And
will soon be over the 50% mark, and the first state to do so, correct?
Let's see what the 2020 census says, probably by 2030. Okay. California will be number 1, Texas is number 2, and if I remember correctly, according to the U.S. Census, 5 by the end of the century will be majority Latino, yes.
What about politically in California with Latinos? Because Latinos in politics right now, it's a hot topic.
Sure, if they vote, right? Exactly.
Well, what is a little bit about that? What may be keeping the ones who are eligible to vote from going to the polls?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure, right? There might be certain impediments based on whether or not you feel that you deserve the. My mother doesn't vote, right? She's born here, raised here. My grandmother never voted, right? Born here, raised here. And so I couldn't, wild horse is going to take my mother to the polling station and make her to vote, right? I can't not, and I just kind of gave up. She's born here 1946, right? And she's 70 now, and she's never voted once. So she was born and raised in an era when she had to sit at the back of the bus, right? And you would think that would be a motivation, but I'm not sure, right? There might be a generational thing. There might be, maybe if you just got your residency, maybe you just don't somehow feel you're worthy of it or deserve it, especially if you just got here recently. However you if you're obviously not documented, you can't do this. Mm-hmm. But maybe you just recently became naturalized, maybe just recently became legalized. maybe you're part of some of these programs like a DACA, Delayed Action for Childhood Arrival. I don't think they can vote. But if Tejanos in Texas, for example, voted en masse, they could really, really, really change the electoral vote there in Texas, right? And they're 38% of the population in Texas. That's the second state that will become majority, that will break the 50% barrier, probably more towards the middle of the century. A third of Arizonans are Latino, right? And so if they voted consistently, there's political power there,
Sure.
But it's not being maximized. And I don't know that I have the answer to that just yet.
If, say they did, say it was maximized, the Latino vote, would you foresee most of them voting in the same form and fashion?
No, right? Cubans are Cubans are different, right? Cubans are Republican. Some data coming out with Cuban youth, a greater diversity, variety. But Cuban elders are Republican, especially those that fled in late 50s with the arrival of Castro. No, Cubans, and do have a privileged process by which they can get naturalized. Puerto Ricans. So migration politics don't apply to all Latinos, and there's an assumption that it does, but Puerto Ricans are born into their citizenship, right? The Jones Act, 1917. So they're not immigrants per se. They don't go through customs, they don't need a green card, right? And Cubans are considered refugees, but they still have a very streamlined process to citizenship. So Cubans and Puerto Ricans, migration politics doesn't necessarily apply. I'm not saying that all Cubans or Puerto Ricans are not interested in it, but not to the degree that, say, those of Mexican ancestry and certainly Central Americans, for whom immigration politics is a big thing. And so it just depends on what Latino group you're a part of, right? All Latinos are not the same. And so, and yes, you have conservative Republican Latinos who will vote for Donald Trump. I don't understand it, right? I think the man has made clear his policies toward the Latino community overall and building a wall, but I mean, I guess that's just part of the American dream, to vote your conscience as you see fit, right? The Latino community is a diverse one politically, and so don't assume that it's a monolithic bloc politically. That would be a mistake to assume that. And I think Cubans and Puerto Ricans are a good example of that. But even within those of Mexican ancestry, Texans, Californians are different. They just are. They're different. I don't know if I can explain it. I have enough time to, but there's nuances and there's subtleties. Tejanos and Chicanos in California, a big one. I just thought, for example, I just thought going into the military, I just thought just focusing on those of Mexican ancestry, I just thought we were all the same. But yeah, it was an eye opener. No, Tejanos are different. They just are. I don't know if I can explain it well. But Tejanos are different. Texas politics are a little bit different from California politics, right? So that produces a different Mexican American in Texas than, say, a Mexican American in California. And Central Americans are a new wild card. My wife is of Salvadoran ancestry. She's born here. Her parents are migrants from El Salvador. They're a new wild card into the whole Latino mix of it all. And you've been seeing a lot of these images of these 5, 8, 10-year-olds, right? You had a 3-year-old, right? In some of these detention centers in Arizona, Texas, California. And so I think people are just now beginning to try to understand the Central American experience there, which dates back to some of our policies historically, some of our interferences, some of the massive human rights violations, and some of the dictatorships you've supported there, which all makes us have to look in the mirror, but that can be a difficult thing for people. In other words, you have to look at U.S. foreign policy over the last century, and that can be a difficult thing for people to do, to want to look in the mirror and say, I have a role to play in why they're coming here, right? Right. So, Central Americans are new, and they're not, there's tension not only with the mainstream for them, but there's tension with other Latino groups. Yeah, yes, that can produce tension. Yeah. And there's some here, right? Tyson is the big culprit here, however you want to call them. I mean, the how Springdale came into existence. That's Tyson. Right. Tyson in the 90s, early, probably as a result of NAFTA, right? 93, 94, when NAFTA's passed, North American Free Trade Agreement. Tyson began to import, through a type of immigration process called sponsored immigration, began to import guest workers, right? And if you keep renewing their visas, they can qualify for a green card if enough time passes. I think it's 5 years. And so enough time has passed to where you have a very big Latino community in the South, in Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, right? And so Central Americans and Mexicanos and probably community individuals already here, probably also from the Southwest, right? So it isn't all just from south of the border, probably from north of the border too, right? Leaving places like California and Texas for one of two reasons, right? It's just better job prospects here. Mm-hmm. It's cheaper, better job prospects, and crime, right? 500 dead Latino youth 2015 as a result of gang warfare, right? Killing each other. And so that's a big push out.
Right.
Tragically, the crime can follow, right? Because there's MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha 13. There's a chapter here in Springdale. But Springdale for many is just the chances of a better life, right? But it's introduced into a part of the country that historically does not have a Latino presence.
Right.
And so, right, the New South, right, what they're using now is El Nuevo South, right, just in Spanish. The El Nuevo just means is new in Spanish, right? And so it's creating interesting community dialogue, interesting community mixture, interesting community diversity. It's also creating difficulty, sure, yes. So it's a new type of contact, right, in a place that historically hasn't had a Latino presence. Right. But this is the epicenter, this is the epicenter. The data is pointing now that this is the new epicenter for Latino growth, is the American South.
Okay.
So 1/6 of the population as of the 2010 census, Latinos overall, will double by 2100, will become 1/3 the population, right? And that continued growth, is the epicenter for that continued growth is here in the South. And so the South's changing. Yeah.
Very much. Switching gears a little bit, you have a new book coming out in April.
Get a drink of water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
The book's about the Chicano experience in the military, if I'm correct. What is the name of it?
Soldados Rasos, which is literally translates into race soldiers.
Okay.
Soldados Rasos at war, Chicano politics, identity, and masculinity in the U.S. military from World War II to Vietnam.
And you yourself, obviously, in the military.
There's a lot of personal in there, sure.
Sure. Just
It's a
kind
reflection of me.
Walk us through a little bit about, I guess, the history of Latinos in the military. Why they would enlist, why they would be so willing to fight for a country that sometimes maybe didn't recognize them as part.
It's historically been small.
Okay.
Right? It's been growing. Like, for example, in the book, towards the end, I make the comparison with the African American community, which has been strong. It's been large, especially with the end of the draft in '73. The black presence in the military has been at about 25%. It's varied, it's fluctuated, lower 20s, even upper 20s, but it's been pretty constant around 24, 25% for a population that's about 11% of the population overall. To produce 1/4 of the entire personnel of the military, that's massive, right? But that segues into all sorts of different social issues too, right? That the black community would view, obviously is viewing the U.S. military as a kind of a job corps too, right? Which is not to besmirch their patriotism either in saying that. The Latino presence has been small, no. Not segregated, right? Because technically declared de jure white, and so that meant Chicanos, Mexican Americans weren't segregated, or Puerto Ricans. And so with the end of the draft in '73, the Latino population, the representation in the military is about 5%. For a community that was about 10%. And so as we speak now, the Latino presence, that's all of them, Chicano, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, et cetera, is about at 10%. For a population of 16, right around 15, 16%. So it's underrepresented, in other words. It's been growing, but not as rapidly as the population overall within the United States. That kind of begs the question why, sure.
Yeah.
There's something about the military that is inviting. There's machismo involved, which you can argue about any community. There's a sense of manhood, right? Military service is a stepping stone into manhood. That's as old as military service itself and warfare itself. Getting the GI Bill, I mean, that was a motivation for me. Socioeconomic mobility, these are all factors, but not enough, obviously, because there's still an underrepresentation. And you would think that Latinos actually would flock to an institution that offers I mean, yes, there's a risk of dying overseas, yes. But for an institution that offers a package of perks that is actually pretty good, you would think that the representation would be more, but that's not the case just yet. Growing, but it's growing slowly.
Okay.
So now for the recently arrived, there was a lot of publicized deaths with our invasion of Iraq 2003. They were called green card GIs. For the recently arrived, like DACA individuals or the DREAM Act, right? A little known aspect to it, you serve 2 years minimum or more, and you get your honorable discharge. You can get your green card that way. And so it's been streamlined, the process. So for the more recently arrived and for the undocumented, I totally see the military service as a venue toward becoming a citizen, toward joining the mainstream, becoming legal, right? And then from there, trying to get your citizenship after.
What was your personal experience like, kind of whenever you transitioned into the military as a Latino? What was it like for you?
Shock.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a cultural shock. I grew up. I mean, there was a handful of different motivations. We grew up poor, right? I was raised by a single mother. Went to bed hungry pretty much every night. Saw my mother cry herself to sleep pretty much every night for lack of basic necessities such as food. And so I had to get the hell out. And so that, for me, the service was a way to do that. It was a huge cultural shock. I never saw so many white and black folk ever, right? Because in essence, I grew up in not a de jure segregated environment, but East LA was 99% Latino. So in a de facto sense, I grew up in a segregated environment. And it was number one and number two was a huge masculine shock. I was raised by two women that maybe sheltered me in a certain sense as to what it meant to be a man. I mean, my father was as useless as a man can be, in terms of meeting his commitments as a parent, as a man, and as a spouse. Right? So that was another motivation too, actually. Being a father now, that kind of drives me also, that experience. And so, no, the military was a way to get up, get out, get into a better position economically, socially. Gave me the GI Bill. I mean, I've used my 28 years. I've used my military service pretty well. I've gotten a BA. I've gotten a PhD. I became an officer in 2010. I was an enlisted guy for 22 years. I can't complain. Navy's been good to me. I don't know if that's a story that all personnel or enlisted or servicemen convey, but I can't complain.
Sure.
No. I mean, I've used it. It's used me, I suppose, but I've used it to better myself.
Mm-hmm. Switching gears again a little bit, I know you teach a class at the University of Arkansas about Latinos in film. I'm curious, I am a graduate of the New York Film Academy, so I have a big interest in film itself. I'm curious a little bit about the history and what you know about Latinos in film in general.
I mean, the stereotypical Latin lover, right, in terms of the male or the swarthy bronze. I think they call it the bronze image in film. I think there's something like that out there also, or the Spitfire, the Latina, Rita Moreno in West Side Story. So, I mean, these images have been, part of the stereotypical process by which you convey the non-white other has a long history to it in Hollywood. Right, the black image in film is huge. There's stereotypes all over the place in that sense. Certainly for the Latino image in film, sure. Right, and I don't know that it's entirely gone away either in TV or in film. And so media has a huge role to play in how we view communities, especially if you have minimal contact with that community. And some of these stereotypes can be pretty vicious and long-lasting. And so if that's all you see is this representation of a group over and over and over again, it can help sway how you view that group, sure, I have no doubt at all. Especially, this is a contentious election year, and I have no doubt some of these stereotypes that have been in existence in the media for some time have a role to play in that, most definitely, so sure.
Do you see it changing at all?
I don't know. I'm not a cinematographer in any way, shape, or form. I hope it is. And I hope so. All we can do is our small little part.
Yeah, I would like to think that diversity in general is, well, it's becoming more of a topic, which you have to talk about it first, right?
It's a more diverse U.S. That is unsettling to a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Right, definitely. It's a more diverse U.S. It's diversity broadly defined, right? Historically, there is a black-white binary in this country, and so the Latino population is exploding, the Asian American population is exploding, Middle Eastern population is exploding. They're all growing, and so race isn't just specific to just one group now. Discussions over race, and that can be unsettling for a lot of folk. Yes, and so I'm hopeful. Right? Sheer numbers alone, you would think, sheer numbers alone, at least in the case of Latinos, 1/6 the population, it will double. Sheer numbers alone, whatever it is your opinion of them might be, I mean, sheer numbers alone would hopefully produce some kind of tolerance, dialogue down the road, mid-century, end of the century at some point. But of course, I mean, time will tell. Right? I can't guarantee that.
One thing I want to ask you about being here, whenever you first came to Northwest Arkansas area, did you have any premeditated idea of what the Latino community might be like in Arkansas? Had you ever been here before?
Well, I had some premeditated notions about the South, period.
Sure.
Can I say that on film?
Absolutely.
No, I don't want to admit to this. Its legacy isn't the best, right? Especially in terms of race. I was apprehensive about that. I don't want to open up all sorts of different boxes. Some of my apprehensions I think have proven true in that sense. Some other shocks were just maybe certain notions of gender and gender politics and what some might call sexism. That my apprehensions in that regard have proven true. What I expected about the Latino community is that it would be recently arrived, and actually it proved correct. I haven't been proven wrong in that sense. And so migration politics would be huge, probably more Spanish dominant, with English in there, of course, yes. But I made a few quick observations about what I would be arriving into. I'd heard of Springdale, right? I'd never been here before, right? But I had heard of Springdale as one of those pockets of Latinidad in the South. Sort of like Dalton, Georgia, certain spots, Greensboro in North Carolina. Or it's in certain spots, it's in pockets in the South. So I'd heard of Springdale, and obviously I had no idea what it would actually be like. Being here, I think I've been proven to myself. I've been proven true that the initial observations I had have been proven true. Yes.
How can you and other educators, how can you help combat something like racism?
I mean, it's a big question, right? Lack of a better word, I think you fight the battles. I think you fight, right? You think you keep on, I think it's a consistent, you consistently have to put forth the message. Maybe fighting wasn't the best word. You have to consistently be proactive with students, with colleagues, and then a third element perhaps is also community outreach, which an aspect to cultural studies, ethnic studies, that has been nothing but vilified from the beginning, from the origins of ethnic studies, late 60s, early 70s, right? The ivory tower is an insular tower unto itself. You do not engage with the local communities. And so a healthy component of what I do is community outreach. Some do it better than others. I don't know if I'm the best person to do it, but I try. But engaging with students in Springdale, engaging with Springdale High, showing them, putting a Latino face to a PhD, putting a Latino face to the professorship, period, to an institution of higher learning such as the University of Arkansas. I think it mattered to me to see a Latino face teaching me a class. And I hope it matters to Latinos as well too. And so I think dealing with colleagues, dealing with students, and dealing with the local community, establishing links to the local community outreach. I think through those three, to that sort of that triad, you can't make people be receptive to what your message is, but at least you can expose them to it. Sometimes you do have to bash the door in, well then you do it. At least I do, if I have to.
I think that's a good approach to it. But anyways, we want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Minority Report, Prof. Steve, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.